Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to Has Science Buried God? And a warm welcome. There are 7 churches within Reading who've organised this event, along with the Reading University Christian Union. I just want to spend a couple of minutes explaining what's going to happen tonight and take you through how we're going to run the evening. So, a couple of things to mention in terms of housekeeping. As you may have noticed, we've actually got 2 lecture theatres tonight where we're holding this event. So you in front of me are the lucky ones that you get to see John here in the full kind of 3D experience. If you are in the lecture theatre next door, hopefully you can see everything which is being live streamed tonight. In terms of toilets, you hopefully saw them. They're outside in the foyer area, well signposted. And fire exits are also signposted too. We have no plans to do any kind of fire drill tonight, so if you do hear the fire alarm, make your way to the nearest exit as soon as you can. Let me spend a couple of minutes explaining the structure of this evening. So what's going to happen first is I will do a quick introduction with John Lennox. So he and I will just spend a bit of time chatting about his background, and this will really give us an idea of who he is and the type of individual he is and what sort of things he does today. Secondly, John will take over and the main event will commence, so he will talk to us on the topic of Has Science Buried God? Now, after that, we'll then go into a Q&A, and I'll spend a bit of time now explaining how this is going to work. So, if the technology doesn't let us down, the plan is that we will use Slido tonight. So if you take your phones out and go to slido.com, then it will ask you for a participant code. If you put in 1642, then you should be asked to submit a question. Now, the plan is, as we go through the evening, as John is talking, then please do submit your questions. We're not going to wait until the very end to gather them all up. The idea is that as we go, you keep on submitting the questions in. At the end of John's talk, he'll then be given an iPad with all the questions grouped together. Now, clearly, with the amount of people we've got this evening, we're not going to be able to answer everybody's question, so please bear with us. We'll try and cover as many as we possibly can. So, slido.com, that's your participant code. I won't be showing this slide again, so if you forget the participant code or you don't make a note of it on the piece of paper in front and your neighbour's forgotten, then no questions. However, I can see many people on phones and making notes, so we should be fine. So, that's how the Q&A is going to work. After the evening finishes, we would ask you to stay around if you want to. We've got refreshments outside. There's also a book stall with lots of books around this kind of topic, which we'd welcome you to browse too. Unfortunately, John isn't able to stay around tonight. He needs to shoot off to catch a train. So if you've got a question, don't work on the basis that you'll be able to grab John for a couple of minutes at the end. You won't. Submit it as part of the Q&A session. So, the last thing I want to mention, sorry, I hope you don't mind if I borrow this, is your feedback forms. So you should have one of these bits of paper in front of you. And it's really important for us that we get feedback from you on what you've enjoyed about the evening, what's worked well, what could work better. The other part of the feedback form is really for us to understand if you want any kind of follow-up. Maybe there's something you hear tonight and you think I'd be really interested in having a further dialogue on that particular point. So please do indicate that on the feedback form. There are some silver buckets at the end here. Do just drop the forms into the silver buckets as you're leaving. That would be really, really helpful for us, and we really appreciate it if you could do that. So, those are all the housekeeping bits over and done with, you'll be pleased to know. It's my honour tonight to introduce Professor John Lennox. John Lennox is the Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at Oxford University an Emeritus Fellow in Mathematics and the Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College. He's also an Associate Fellow of the Said Business School at Oxford University, Adjunct Lecturer at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, and Senior Fellow of the Trinity Forum. He's produced over 70 published mathematical papers, as well as co-authoring 2 research monographs. In addition to this, he has also written numerous books on the interface between science, philosophy, and theology. He's an internationally renowned speaker who has lectured at universities around the world and has also debated a number of the world's best-known atheists, including Richard Dawkins, Peter Singer, and the late Christopher Hitchens. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have John Lennox with us tonight. Please give him a very warm welcome. John, firstly, thank you for being here and welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I hope, ladies and gentlemen, you are sitting comfortably, because I am.
John, it would be great to get to know you a little bit better. Can you just tell us a bit about upbringing? I detect some kind of accent there. Where were you from? What was home life like?
Well, the accent you detect is not a Scottish accent, which disappoints you, of course. But if you pursue my family back 300 years, it would have been a Scottish accent.
Getting better.
I grew up in Northern Ireland, and that country hasn't always had the best of reputations, as you know, particularly in connection with its religious violence and terrorism. My parents were very unusual in that, in a very sectarian country, they were Christian without being sectarian, which meant that in the business family store that my father ran, he tried, in spite of all the difficulties, to employ people equally across the religious divide. That resulted in bombings. It also resulted in my brother having the full blast of a bomb in his face. And that, of course, damaged him, but he survived it. And it's important to my story because what I learned from my parents was to treat everyone with respect, no matter what they believe. And he practiced it at great cost. And he left an indelible mark on us. The second thing is that although they were Christians, they allowed me to think. And I owe them an unrepayable debt for stimulating me to think about all kinds of things, not just about Christianity. Because I grew up in a home where, although my parents had no formal education beyond a very rudimentary one, my father was a voracious reader and encouraged me to read other worldviews. And that started me on a path of being fascinated by what other people think. And I've been doing it all my life, really.
And so was it part of that, the reading and the thinking that you described, is that when you got into maths?
Oh, no. I got into maths as a little kid. I found I was good at arithmetic, and I turned out to be, I believe, it's probably mythology, but I was the only child in the school that asked for extra homework. And that developed an interest at the beginning because I was good at it, but then my interest changed. And I became very interested in languages. First of all, I wanted to be a classicist, and then that changed to modern languages. And then I became an amateur radio operator when I was 14. I discovered you could learn language by radio very fast. But the radio intrigued me then. I wanted to be an electrical engineer.
Okay.
And I applied and got a scholarship to Queen's, but then the headmaster came one day and he said, Lennox, would you like to have a go at Cambridge? And I said, well, I'd love to. But he said, not for electrical engineering, because we can't teach at this school physics or chemistry to the right standard, but we can teach maths. So what about it? So I did maths and ended up in Cambridge.
Okay. And you mentioned that passion for languages. What opportunities have you had over the course of your life to use the languages that you've learned?
Oh, enormous opportunity. I was brilliantly taught at school. I owe a great deal, as we all do, to good teachers. But the Latin teacher especially, he was so enthusiastic that if a pupil came and said, sir, I'd like to learn Russian, he would learn it and then teach it to the pupil. And I've used my languages a great deal, particularly German, in the German-speaking world, and then to a lesser extent Russian in the last few years. So they've been important. For many years, I was a translator of mathematical Russian into English, and that was a preparation for spending quite a bit of time in Siberia, particularly.
Tell us more about that. I mean, we can't just let that one drop. I think there's, probably plenty to talk about there.
Well, I suppose life is complex, and our analyses of our own motivations is difficult. But I've always been interested in people who didn't share my Christian worldview and why they didn't. And I tended to focus on atheism, which was the direct opposite of my Christian faith. And having been encouraged to, after my first degree, to go to Germany, after my PhD actually, to go to Germany and getting the language fluently, it enabled me to visit the German Democratic Republic during the Cold War, where I could see the effect of atheism in a culture, and just to see the extent to which it influenced people. And one of those moving things that affect you, I never forget being in a home in the 1970s when a girl came home. She was 14. She was weeping her heart out. She was a very bright child. She'd just been told by the school she could not have any further education. Brightest child in the school. And the reason given was that she would not swear allegiance to the atheistic state. And I said to her, what did you say to the teacher? And she said, I said to the teacher, Uncle John, that one day he would stand before God and answer for what he'd done to me that day. 14 years old, talk about courage. We were deeply moved. And incidents like that build up a picture. And I had many, many visits because I could travel freely because I got the language in that part of the world. And then when the wall fell, and I helped to knock it down actually, but that's another story. I started traveling to Russia, and that was in a way much more interesting because they'd had 75 years of communism. And, well, perhaps I'll write a book someday, but it was a huge privilege. Because of my Russian, I was able to lecture in my mathematical field in Russian, and that opened every door to me. They're very generous, Russian people, and if you have a go at their language, they will let you speak. And so I ended up in Siberia, and I found that even in mathematics seminars, they would ask questions that you'd never get in the UK. I'll never forget.
Give us an example.
The first time I can, yes. The first time it happened in Akademgorodok in Novosibirsk, I'd given a lecture. They were very polite about my work and so on. And then they said, can we ask you other questions? I said, sure. We hear you believe in God. Why? Just like that. And I discovered night after night, because I was there for a couple of months, that's all they wanted to talk about, because many of them had never met an academic who believed in God. They thought it was utterly impossible. And so I was asked to explain myself in front of the university.
And so, John, just let me ask you there, what was the response then and the feeling from the other academics that you're working alongside?
In Russia? Oh, enormous curiosity from most of them.
Okay.
And sometimes amazing honesty. I recall once they invited me to their homes every night, and they'd pile people in, and they would ply me with questions. And I remember one night I'd been chatting, and it was a very gifted applied mathematician. And at the end of the evening, he said to everybody, everybody in this room except you, pointing at me, knows that I'm a hard atheist. And I thought that Christianity was for old ladies and young children. But he said, frankly, he said, I am meeting arguments in my home tonight I've never heard of before. And he looked at me and he said, you've got to be patient with me because I haven't even got the language to formulate how to process this. It's so entirely new. So that kind of thing.
And was that when your fascination of atheism was born then?
Oh, no. That goes right back to arriving in Cambridge.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, it goes back to the obvious thing that we Irish get. You know, you believe in God because you're Irish, that kind of argument. And they all believe in God and they fight about it. Mm-hmm. And I met that in week 1 at Cambridge, and I thought, well, could that be true? I mean, after all, my parents are Christian, so are my grandparents and several generations back. So it's Irish genetics, isn't it? And that prompted me to befriend people deliberately who didn't share my worldview, who were atheist or agnostic. And that dialogue has never stopped. I've been doing it all my life.
So it sounds like that befriending and the dialogue escalated somewhat. Obviously, you know, debating with Dawkins, with Hitchens. How did you get from that kind of dialogue with your peers at university to debating some of these really well-known individuals?
Well, of course, the turning point was the debate with Dawkins, which was arranged by a friend in Alabama. It's, the story, I'm not sure that I understand it completely, why Dawkins agreed, because for a long time before that, he wouldn't debate people like me. But the Alabamans wanted a little bit of the Oxford debate, the God debate, you see. So he agreed to do that, and I little imagined that it would give me a world stage, actually, and it accelerated very rapidly after that.
So I just want to ask a couple of questions then on the debates. As you approach one of these debates, what's your objective? Is it, I'm going to win? I'm gonna catch them out. I'm gonna get my opponent speechless. What are you looking to do in the debates?
It's none of those things, actually. When I was waiting with Richard Dawkins in the wings at the first debate, this was in America. The second debate was in Oxford. He said to me, you know, I don't debate really. Well, I knew that, of course. Well, I said, Richard, if it's any comfort, I don't either. It's the first time I'd ever really done it. And I said, my motive is to go in, not to win arguments, but to try to state a rational alternative to your atheism. I'm interested in putting ideas before the public and let them judge. He said, I'll buy that. So we went in and did it. And I think that's very important. If you go to win, you might win. But often it will be at the loss of credibility. You'll cheapskate the argument, you'll cut corners, and there's enormous pressure in a confrontational debate to such an extent that most of us don't want them anymore. My atheist colleagues don't want them. They'd much prefer a moderated discussion. And I've just been in America and I had a moderated discussion with an atheist philosopher. And those kind of things go very well because they're not so tightly scripted and they don't take hundreds of hours of preparation, you see. So I go in simply to try to present something that will form an alternative to the other speaker so that people can go away and make their own minds up.
Okay. And do you have then a particular, either a debate or a particular point in one of the debates that you've done which is really memorable, sticks out for either good or bad reason?
Oh, there are many memorable, even funny things. I did a debate in the Netherlands, a huge audience, several thousand, and there was a physicist put up against me, and he said, you know, your belief in God is like belief in Santa Claus. So I said, why don't we test this, you see? And he was quite curious what I meant by testing it. So I put it to the audience, and I said, how many of you came to believe in Santa Claus as adults? And of course, no hand went up. And then I said, how many of you came to believe in God as adults? There were hundreds of hands went up. I said, you know, this is really not a question that makes any sense at all. Some of the best minds in the world have spent centuries thinking about the God question. They haven't been doing the same work on Santa Claus. So putting the two in the same category is, if you don't mind me saying so, rather silly. I don't think he was very pleased with that. But it is astonishing how often that kind of argument is used.
So, last question then from me, and then I'll move on. If someone that you're debating has got a really compelling argument, and they maybe explain something or they show you something in a way you've never thought of before, and that thing would be critical enough to kind of move or change your argument in respect of the existence of God, would you be willing to change your mind?
Of course one is willing to change one's mind for the reason, as I'll be explaining later. My Christian faith, as I conceive it, is evidence-based. Now, the answer to your question is that I've spent my whole life looking for those arguments that would topple me. And all I can say is, having exposed my faith in God constantly all around the world to all kinds of opponents, the effect of that has been to strengthen my faith in God immeasurably. Of course, you will always hear arguments that you can't understand because you're not bright enough or you're not in that field and so on and so forth. But you get to a point where it's like, I've been married to the same girl for nearly 50 years. And if somebody came wandering along and said, by the way, do you know what I saw your wife doing? If it was pejorative, I wouldn't immediately say, oh, really? Oh, that's most interesting. I'll have to see whether there's any truth in that or not. I wouldn't believe them because I've got 50 years of experience of her faithfulness. And it's the same here, that if you build up and you've exposed and dealt with question after question after question, person after person after person, then it's inevitable that your confidence grows because your evidence base has grown because you've faced all kinds of things. So I don't expect that to happen. But if someone, for example, could establish without any doubt that Jesus never rose from the dead, that would, of course, finish Christianity. But the Apostle Paul saw that centuries ago.
Okay. Great. Professor Lennox, we could chat all night, but I'm keen to hand over to you. So thank you very much, and we're looking forward to hearing more from you.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is nice to see so many of you here. It means that I'm not like the bishop who, coming to the little country church, discovered as he mounted the pulpit that there were only 2 or 3 elderly people sitting at the back. And the vicar was standing with him, and he said to him, "Vicar, did you tell them I was coming?" And the vicar said, "No, but word seems to have got around." Our topic tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is, has science buried God? And this is a very common viewpoint in the Western world. widespread idea that it is not really possible to be an intellectual of any kind, and certainly not a scientist, and believe in God. And in fact, it's now got to the stage where someone as eminent, and he is very eminent, as Stephen Hawking, says that we need to choose between science and God. And that is a question I'm going to pursue in a little while. And as you've heard, I've had these debates, the God delusion debate and various other debates with Dawkins, Hitchens and so on. Mainly you can find them on YouTube. You can find links to them on my website, johnlennox.org, and you can see them for yourself. Now, what I want to say first of all is a key idea, and that is it really science versus God or something deeper? I think it's something deeper. So let's take two Nobel Prize winners for physics, one a Scotsman and the other an Irishman. You see, we Irish have one Nobel Prize winner for science. So let me introduce him to you, E.T.S. Walton, who split the atom with Sir John Cockcroft, and so was a very worthy joint winner of the Nobel Prize. And Peter Higgs, famous for his prediction of the existence of a boson, which is now called the Higgs boson. These two men at the top of the tree of physics. Their physics doesn't divide them. But Peter Higgs is an atheist, a very friendly atheist. E.T.S. Walton, a Christian. And that very fact that you can have two Nobel Prize winners on opposite sides shows you that the main issue is not between science and God at all, because these are both brilliant scientists. The real issue is between two worldviews, atheism and theism, or as we often say, naturalism and theism. And these two worldviews, roughly speaking, go like this. The naturalism, which is atheistic, says the universe is all that exists. Theism says, no, it is not all that exists. There is a God who created it. Naturalism has its view of the ultimate reality, its mass energy. These days, it's actually nothing, but nothing needs to be explained. With theism, the ultimate reality is God, not the universe. If you are a naturalist, then your mode of explanation, particularly in science, must be bottom-up, because there is no top-down causation. For the theist, the universe requires both bottom-up and top-down explanation. For the naturalist, the universe gives no evidence of God. And for theists like me, the universe gives evidence of God. So you have two diametrically opposed worldviews that are well represented in the academy today. And the main debate is between those worldviews. And there are brilliant people on both sides. It may interest you to know that of all the Nobel Prize winners between 1900 and 2000, over 60% were believers in God. So there are two sides to this question, but it's not science versus God. It's two worldviews. So we alter the question, because now the serious question is, where does science fit with these worldviews? Does it fit mostly with naturalism, or does it fit with theism, or does it not fit with either? Now, how are we going to answer questions like that? There are many ways of approaching them, and I'm only going to be able to suggest to you a few, but that will be probably enough. Which worldviews does science support? Now, we'll be talking about evidence, not proof, unless you take proof in the informal sense. See, people often say to me, can you prove there is a God? Well, if they mean by proof what a pure mathematician like myself calls proof, the answer is no, because you can't prove anything in life by pure mathematical proof except in pure mathematics. Physics, engineering, etc. You can talk about evidence, you can talk about, as the lawyers do, about proof beyond reasonable doubt, but you cannot speak of the rigorous kind of mathematical proof that follows from starting with a set of axioms using an agreed set of laws of inference and coming to conclusions. I cannot prove to you mathematically that my wife of 50 years, as I've told you, loves me. But I'd stake my life on it because I think there's enough evidence for it. And of course, we all do stake our lives on evidence that's less than absolute proof. Every time you go for major surgery, you're doing exactly that. And every time you step on an aeroplane. So we mustn't think that because there's not absolute rigorous mathematical proof, there's no evidence at all. And I'm going to be talking at the level of evidence, pointers that point in particular directions. Now, of course, often when we come to this debate, we find that there are dismissive ways of dealing with it. I've given you one, God and Santa Claus. And of course, the more serious objection there is that the Freudian one, that God is a projection of our desires for a father figure in the sky and so on. Well, the Freudian one has to be taken seriously. It has always interested me because it comes up when people say, well, of course you believe in God, you're Irish. So the Irishness is put forward as a cause of my belief. And because they can put up a cause, they think they've explained it. Now, there are huge dangers with that philosophically, which I'm not going to go into. But the interesting thing about it is that it works both ways. As a brilliant German psychiatrist has pointed out. Now, here's an interesting thing in the debate. Richard Dawkins has written a book called The God Delusion. That's a psychiatric term, and it really is Freudianism. God is a delusion. But Dawkins is not a psychiatrist, and nor am I. So what do we do when we're making statements outside our own field, as I am tonight? We check with the experts. That's the only thing you can do. So when I read this, I thought, let's see what the leading psychiatrists say about this. Is God a delusion? And I immediately found that the head of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the United Kingdom took the exact opposite view. And he said the idea that religion, belief in God, is good for you is the best kept secret of contemporary psychiatry. He said if the result of major studies, even meta-studies, had gone in the opposite direction and it had been demonstrated that belief in God was bad for your health, it would have hit the headlines in every newspaper in the world. But because there's a strong correlation in the other direction, nobody knows anything about it, least of all Richard Dawkins. And it's very interesting to see some of his atheist colleagues commenting on this foray into psychological ideas and trying to use the science of psychology to disprove God. And they come to the conclusion he has not read any of the serious studies whatever. I don't find that impressive. And I have to be so careful myself to check the evidence when it's outside my own field. Manfred Lutz, whom I mentioned, who's the German equivalent of Andrew Sims, he makes a very interesting statement. He said, if there is no God, then of course the Freudian argument is a very good explanation for the existence of religion. If there is no God. But of course he says, if there is a God, then the Freudian explanation is very good when applied to atheism. because it's a projection of the desire not to have to meet an account for the mess up we've made of our own lives and other people's lives in accounting to God. So it works both ways. As Czesław Miłosz, who is a brilliant Polish Nobel Prize winner for literature, put it, he said, atheism is the great opium of the people. The desire not to have anything to do with a God who would make us accountable for what we've done. And then Manfred Lutz gives the bottom line. You see, the argument works both ways, so that neither Freud, Jung, or Frankl can help us at all with a substantive question, which is there a God or not? It simply doesn't help. So these Freudian dismissals don't work. Like this one, which appeared in the newspaper. Stephen Hawking, religion is a fairy story for those afraid of the dark. And I was asked to comment on this very kindly by the same newspaper. So I said, do you want a one-liner? They said, oh, yes, please. So I said, well, atheism is a fairy story for those afraid of the light. Well, it's very kind of you to laugh, but if you've been following my argument, you see neither of the statements proves anything at all. But the important thing to realize is this, that statements by scientists are not necessarily statements of science. So you watch the famous television series by Carl Sagan. The cosmos is all that is, was, or ever shall be. That's a statement by a brilliant cosmologist. But it's not a statement of cosmology. It's a statement of his own personal belief. The problem is that because he's a famous scientist, what he says is given the authority as if it was a statement of science. And that is very problematic today. So moving past Freud, we ask ourselves, what are the sources of evidence? And I'm going to cite three. They are the history of science, the nature and philosophy of science, and the results of science. It's always good to have a serious look at what the historians tell us. And one of the fascinating things that I came across early on, because I was introduced to the writings of C.S. Lewis at a very young age, was the correlation between the Christian worldview of Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries and the rise of modern science. And Lewis, summarizing the views of Alfred North Whitehead and others, said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. This is very interesting, because you see, if we have a look at it, we will discover that far from hindering the rise of science, belief in God was the motor that drove it. And that raises very interesting questions. How then can Stephen Hawking say you've got to choose between science and God? And we'll come back to that question in a moment. But let me cite to you a very eminent historian, Edwin Judge of Australia. Christianity, or above all the biblical doctrine of creation, is itself the creator of the methodology of modern science. We don't hold the Greeks' perspective anymore. In spite of the fact that people keep looking back to it as the origin of science, it is not the origin of science. The book of creation is the origin of modern science, the book of Genesis. And so if you look at the really great pioneer scientists, you will see this very strongly. Galileo, God is known by nature in his works and by doctrine in his revealed word. And Johannes Kepler, who I'm very fond of because I like this quotation, the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order which has been imposed on it by God and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics. And Isaac Newton, the greatest of them all, seems to be probable that God in the beginning formed matter in solid, massy, hard, impenetrable, movable particles. And elsewhere he wrote, "Don't doubt the Creator, because it is inconceivable that accidents alone could be the controller of this universe." And Newton wrote the most famous book in the history of science, the Principia Mathematica. And in it he expressed the desire or the hope that it would convince thinking people of the existence of a deity. Now this is very interesting. When Newton discovered, perhaps most famously, the law of gravitation, he didn't say, "Now I've got a law, I don't need God," which is an idea we'll come back to. No, he said, what a marvelous God who did it that way. So that the more he understood about the universe, the more he admired the genius of the Creator, not the less. Now, if you think for a moment, that's the way our minds work. The more you understand of art, the more you could admire the genius of a Rembrandt, not the less. The more you understand of engineering, the more you could admire the brilliant engineering in a Rolls-Royce, not the less. And so that was the way many of these people thought. They were thinking God's thoughts after him. So the scientific discoveries were simply adding to the dimensions of their worship. They weren't competing with their faith in God in any sense at all. But now along comes Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking is a brilliant man. He was just ahead of me at Cambridge, and he's light years ahead of me in his ability at mathematical physics. And he, for many years, left people tantalized as to whether he left any space for God or not. But in more recent times, he has stated quite clearly that he is an atheist. And so the Times, Hawking, God did not create the universe. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it helps us focus the central problem of this evening's talk. We have Isaac Newton, who discovered the law of gravitation, and he believed in God. Stephen Hawking, who occupied Newton's chair at Cambridge, the Lucasian chair, uses gravity as a reason not to believe in God. So there are two diametrically opposite deductions from the law of gravitation and its consequences. Hawking's argument, which is the central argument of his book co-authored called The Grand Design, is because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. So there's no need for a creator God. Now this has puzzled me. How is it you get one genius who discovers the law of gravity, believing in God, and another genius who uses it to think about black holes and all this kind of thing, uses it to deny the existence of God? So a little bit of logical analysis. How do you get from Newton's theism to Hawking's atheism? And I want to suggest there are three reasons for it. The first is false logic. The second, false ideas about the nature of God. And the third, false ideas about the nature of scientific explanation. So if it's not too late at night for a little bit of logic, let's analyze this statement. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. When I first read that, I thought, come again? Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. But that's a flat contradiction. Because there is something, the universe will create itself from nothing. And then, because there is a law of gravity, not because gravity exists, because there is a law of gravity, but that is a very elementary philosophical mistake. Laws are not creative. Newton's laws of motion never created a universe. In fact, they never even moved a billiard ball in the whole history of the universe. People with cues do that. The law of motion will describe the motion, but it will not cause it. So there is a very interesting can of worms, which I would be happy to open, but the worms are so large I'll keep them in the can. Then the universe can and will create itself. Now, if I say to you, X creates Y, what does that mean? Grammatically, and roughly speaking, if you've got X, you're going to get Y. X creates Y. Now, if I say X creates X, what does that mean? Well, if you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? Well, it seems to me to mean that nonsense remains nonsense, even if high-powered scientists write it. It is an absolutely nonsensical statement. And many philosophers of science have pointed this out, that you just simply cannot get something from nothing. Now, I'm going to resist giving you a little talk about nothing, because I quite enjoy talking about nothing, actually. You may already have come to that conclusion, but I hope not. It is amazing how some people attempt to get out of the problem that's created by contemporary cosmology. What do I mean by that? Well, contemporary cosmology, for the most part, gets you back to a beginning to space-time. Before that, there was nothing physical. And so getting something from nothing is one of the huge tasks of the cosmologist. How do they do it? Well, most of them these days seem to do it by redefining nothing. Well, you might have thought it's very difficult to redefine nothing, because we all know what nothing in its ordinary philosophical sense means. It means the absence of anything. Oh, but no. Here's Lawrence Krauss of the Arizona State University. I've debated him in his book, A Universe from Nothing. And very early on, he says this: surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I put it to you, if your 10-year-old wrote that in class, it's utter nonsense. And yet, because he's got authority as a cosmologist and astrophysicist, people buy it. Hawking talks about a universe from nothing, but when you investigate, his nothing is a quantum vacuum. Well, I got very interested in this, and I ended up being asked to have a debate with Alan Guth, who is the father of modern cosmology, at the MIT Harvard Faculty Club, a pretty daunting audience, if I may say so. And Alan Guth, who invented the theory of inflation, which is one of the most commonly accepted theories now, he is an atheist, and he gave a talk on inflation and said at the end, well, if you want to add God to that, that's fine by me, but I prefer not to. That was all he had to say about God. I then gave my talk and did explicitly mention God. But in the question time, I couldn't resist asking him. I said, Alan, out there in the public, there is much ado about nothing. Nobody seems to understand what you physicists mean, but I want to ask you this. When you use the word nothing in that context, do you mean nothing in the ordinary sense of absence of anything? He said, no, we do not. I said, thank you very much. So they're not getting a universe from nothing. And from a Christian perspective, if I might just mention it, I believe the universe came from nothing physical, but it didn't come from nothing. It came from a creator God who is spirit. Now that would require a lot more evidence, but let's come to the next thing, which is false ideas about God. Now, I wondered, as I've said, why it is that Stephen Hawking says to people, you must choose between science and God. And I suddenly realized that he's not talking about the God of the Bible, the God of the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He's talking about a God of the sort that the ancient Near East believed in. The Roman gods, the Greek gods, the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Medo-Persian gods. And there's a picture of one of the gods of lightning. They were afraid of lightning and postulated a god to account for it. Now, you can understand, sitting in a famous university like this, that you'd get rid of the lightning god in the first lecture on meteorology in this university. Atmospheric physics would dismiss that straight away. And that has given the rise to the fact that any use of the word God is like that. Hawking clearly, from his writings, believes that the God of the Bible is like an ancient Greek God of the gaps, is a technical term we now use for the word God being used as a placeholder. I can't explain it, God did it. And that kind of a God, of course, gets smaller and smaller as science begins to fill in the gap. And if you believe in a God of the gaps, and you can see these two scientists, this is a very famous cartoon. There's a lot of mathematics on the left-hand side and a lot of mathematics on the right-hand side, and in the middle it says, then a miracle occurs. And one scientist says to the other, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. Well, that's the idea. And I've been faced with it often in debate. I did a debate at the Oxford Union with the famous skeptic Michael Shermer. And he said, pointing at me, he said, you're an atheist with respect to Zeus and Baal and Artemis and so on. And I fully agreed with him. I said, yes, I am an atheist. I don't believe in Zeus, Baal, and Artemis. And then he said, we just go one God further, and we don't believe in Jehovah, the God of the Bible. And as I said at the time, I said, you're putting them all in the same category, aren't you? But that's a profound mistake. You see, the ancient gods interest me and have interested me for a long time because they're at the back of a lot of contemporary philosophy even. But just one point I'd like to make. And that is the point that's made by Werner Jaeger, who wrote a definitive book on the ancient gods. And he says, if you look at the gods of antiquity, all of them, or the vast majority of them, are, I quote, descended from the heavens and the earth. The God of the Bible created the heavens and the earth. So there's a vast difference. And I sometimes point out to my friends that the book of Genesis how does it begin? In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. No. It's in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is everything. Now, that is enormously important because it immediately tells you that at least the claim is that the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. He's God of the whole show. The bits you don't understand and the bits you do understand, which now tells you why Newton could happily go on believing in God, and many of us who are scientists do. The more they discover, the more they worship God, because God is not a God of the gaps. So Hawking is not thinking of the biblical God when he dismisses God on the basis of spurious arguments from gravity. So my conclusion from that is this. If you define God to be the explanation for what science has not yet explained, then you have to choose between God and science as a matter of logic. It's worth just reflecting on that. You see, if God is just a placeholder, that you say, well, I can't explain this, therefore God did it, and science is advancing, if that's your God, then of course you're putting God up against science. But that is not the view of the Bible. The God of the Bible is the God of the whole show. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, or in the expression given by the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, all things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. So this is enormously important. Argument number 1 has to do with the history of science. Argument number 2, specifically directed to Hawking, is to say that his central thesis in the book is false logic. The next argument is he has a false conception of God. Now, I could go into this question, but someone is almost bound to ask it in the question time, so I'll leave it from then. If you believe in God as creator, then surely you must be able to ask who created the creator. If you want to ask me that, you may. Thirdly, false ideas about the nature of scientific explanation. What does it mean to say that science explains? Because often that's the way it works. Look, science has explained this, therefore there's no God. Science has explained how the universe comes from nothing, therefore there's no God. Well, let's go back to the law of gravity. What does the law of gravity explain? Now, when I first met the law of gravity at school, I thought it explained gravity. It doesn't, you know. I learned that years later, that Newton was very careful to point out in a famous statement, non fingo hypothesi, I do not make hypotheses. In other words, I have no explanation for the nature of gravity. What he did was think of a brilliant law which has got 8 symbols by which we can do superb calculations. Newton's law on its own, by the way, without Einsteinian corrections, can land a person on the moon. It's a work of utter genius. To compress the relative motion of heavy bodies into an equation involving 8 symbols. But the point is, the law does not explain what gravity is, even though it enables you to do these calculations. So within science itself, a scientific explanation is rarely, if ever, a complete explanation. Wittgenstein got it dead right when he said the great delusion of modernity is that the laws of nature explain the universe for us. The laws of nature describe the universe. They describe the regularities, but they explain nothing. Now that is immensely important because it stops the cry, science explains, therefore there is no God. That is just a non sequitur. It doesn't work. We need to probe explanation a little bit further. So let's do it. Let's ask the question why the water is boiling. Well, it's boiling because the heat from the gas flame is being conducted through the bottom of the copper kettle. You'll see we're still in Ireland. Bottom of the copper kettle. And that's agitating the molecules of water. And that's why it's boiling. Well, it's actually boiling because I'd like a cup of tea. Now think, those are 2 totally different kinds of explanation. One is in terms of scientific law and mechanism. The other is in terms of personal agency, volition, and desire. Now, the important thing about them is this. Both of those explanations are necessary if you want a full picture. Secondly, they don't conflict with one another, nor do they compete. They complement. They are different kinds of explanation. And interestingly, the personal one is usually more important than the scientific one. People have been drinking tea and enjoying it for centuries before they knew anything about heat equations. Do you get the message? The message is crucially important. There are different levels of explanation. And there's a very dangerous view, current, in parts of the academy, that science is the only guide to truth. We call that scientism. And it's a very odd view. Dawkins believes it, so does Hawking. He says it explicitly in the book I've just quoted, that scientists are left holding the torch of truth. But ladies and gentlemen, if science were the only way to truth, then half of the faculties in this university would have to close tomorrow. Worse still, the statement science is the only way to truth is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. It's logically incoherent. And it's worth pointing out that a really great scientist like Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize, he said it's so very easy to see that science is limited. It cannot even answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of my life? And he said it is to religion and literature and philosophy that we have to look for answers. And he added, it does science no service whatsoever by saying it is the only way to truth. Einstein saw it and many others saw it, but unfortunately today we have almost a pandemic of the feeling that if it's not a scientific statement, then it's got nothing to do with truth. And the correlative of that is that science then becomes identical with rationality, which of course is absurd. Science is not coextensive with rationality, of course not. Otherwise, literature would be irrational. The arts, languages, history, and all of these things. It is an overreach that is very dangerous. But a final point on this question of explanation, and that is this. Newton's law of gravitation no more competes with God as an explanation of the universe than the law of internal combustion competes with Henry Ford as an explanation of the motor car. It is very odd to me that people can say that science somehow competes with God. You see, Richard Dawkins thinks that the God explanation is a scientific explanation, when it clearly isn't. It's a personal explanation. So there isn't any competition. Just as we would never say, I sometimes do for fun in a school, I say to kids, I'm going to give you 2 explanations for the motor car. Henry Ford and the law of internal combustion. And you get 10-year-olds put up their hands and say, but sir, you need both. Why can some professors not see that? It is serious, actually. Seriously concerning that the idea that explanation is multiply dimensional has been pushed back in our society. Well, let me just say 1 or 2 more things about the nature of explanation, because you will get an objection. Richard Dawkins formulates it very well. Using God as an explanation is absurd, since God is by definition more complex than the thing you're explaining. That sounds very impressive until you apply it to Richard Dawkins himself, which I did. Think about that argument and apply it to the God Delusion, which is a book of some 400 pages. It's quite complex, I discovered. So I was interested in what its origin was. And somebody came along and said, actually, this book originates in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. And I said, that's no explanation, because your explanation is more complex than the thing you're explaining. Which is absolutely true, isn't it? What is missing here, ladies and gentlemen? It is wonderful, and in all the sciences, including mathematics, explaining the complex in terms of the simple is one of the things we strive for. We split a big problem into little problems, and we study the little problems and hope they give us insight on the big problem. Methodological reductionism, that is called. But there is one area of thought in science and outside it, where that never works. Why doesn't it work? It never works where language is involved. And sometimes I do a little experiment with people. And at dinner in my college in Oxford, I have confronted several people, eminent people in their fields. And one particular evening, there was a man who said he didn't like sitting beside me at all because he discovered I was a pure mathematician. And he said, how dreadfully boring. So that was a bit difficult to cope with because he clearly meant it. So I said, you know, actually I tried to make up for the unsociable nature of my academic discipline by being interested in the big questions. He said, what big questions? Well, I said, like the status of the universe. Is it created or not? Oh, he said, it's far worse than I thought. Listen, I'm an atheist, I'm a reductionist, we've nothing to talk about. Oh, I said, on the contrary, I'm fascinated by reductionism. I know at least 3 kinds. Which kind are you? So we started to talk, and we agreed we were both methodological reductionists. But he said, that's not what I really am. I believe that everything can be reduced to physics and chemistry. I said, yes, you're an ontological reductionist. He said, absolutely. So we've nothing to talk about. I said, we have. Let's talk about the menu. So he said, what's the problem? I said, from where? I said, no problem at all, but let's see. And I looked at the word roast chicken, R-O-A-S-T, and I pointed it out. And he said, that's roast. I said, how do you know that those symbols mean roast? Well, he said, because I've learned English. Oh, very good. So the symbols put in that way have meaning. Yes, he said, of course they do. Okay, you're a reductionist. Yes. Okay, I said, please explain to me the way those 5 symbols, put like that, carry meaning. And explain it, please, as a reductionist in terms of the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. His wife was beside him, delightful lady. And she said, get out of that if you can. But he won't mind me telling this story because he was so honest. He stopped and he said, it can't be done. And I was so taken aback at this honesty. I said, but physics and chemistry have only been going 500 or 600 years. He said, it doesn't matter. In order to explain that, you've got to introduce a mind. Because whatever physical processes are behind making this menu, the moment you see symbols that carry meaning, that are semiotic in that sense, you've got to induct upwards to a mind, not downwards to physics and chemistry. And then he looked at me, hopefully, and he said, where did you get that argument? I said, it's okay, I got it from a Nobel Prize winner. Oh, he said, what a relief. But then you see, it goes further because he studied DNA. And I said, now there's a word with 3.5 billion letters in a chemical alphabet. Every letter in the right place. I said, what about that? What's the origin of that? And he said, chance and the laws of nature. I said, just a minute. We looked at 5 letters on the menu, and you postulate a mind. And now we're talking about 3.5 billion letters in the right order. I said, something curious is going on, isn't it? He said, there must be. And you see, this is very interesting. Now, this is a huge subject, ladies and gentlemen. Because in this juxtaposition of 2 worldviews, I've used the word naturalism. But materialism is a slightly narrower concept. And Dawkins appears to be a materialist, and so does Hawking. That is, everything is reducible to physics and chemistry. But you see, the interesting thing is we live in the information age. And the one thing becoming increasingly clear about the nature of information is that it is not material. It cannot be reduced to the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink, as Nobel Prize winner Roger Sperry said. So a huge challenge to materialist philosophy is the existence of an information-bearing macromolecule. Now, the University of Reading boasts a very distinguished philosopher, the late Antony Flew. The last time I was in Reading, I was interviewing him to talk to him about the fascinating change of mind he experienced in his old age. And this is a quotation from him. Research into DNA had shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life that intelligence must have been involved. I have been persuaded that it is simply out of the question that the first living matter evolved out of dead matter and then developed into an extraordinarily complicated creature. Now, for someone of Antony Flew's ability and reputation, this was a huge thing to say. Antony Flew was, in his day, the Richard Dawkins of his day, one of the world's most famous atheists and a world expert on the work of David Hume. So that for him to be convinced by the linguistic nature of DNA, it's not that DNA is complex, please notice that, it's the nature of the linguistic complexity, to come to believe in a deity, as he puts it in his book, was an extraordinary thing. And in fact, I well remembered when I walked into my college common room on the day I learned this, and I spoke to a philosopher, another very distinguished philosopher, friend of mine, and I said to him, Antony Flew. Oh, he said, brilliant philosopher. I said, he's just announced he's come to believe in God. Oh, senility, he said. But it was too late. It was too late. What am I suggesting here? Now, this isn't knockdown proof. This is evidence. But what is it evidence of? It's evidence, to my mind, of the fact that the worldview that starts with the mind of God, in the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. The alternative, you see, is in the beginning there was nothing, or in the beginning there were the particles. So that in the Christian worldview, in the biblical worldview, word, mind, is primary and everything else is derivative. Whereas in the materialist worldview, it is the exact opposite. So finally, if we got a few more minutes, let's look at something that is very important. You see, there is a lot of confusion in the world today about what we mean by faith. Again, as a result of the new atheists, faith has come to mean a religious concept that means believing where there's no evidence. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is blind faith. The ordinary use of the word faith, which we all use, faith, belief, trust, they're all essentially the same. When we trust someone or have faith in them, or trust a fact or believe in it or have faith in it, we usually look for some grounds for that trust, faith, or belief. Evidence-based belief or faith or trust is something we're all familiar with. But by redefining faith as blind faith, what has happened is many people have become blind-sided, where they think that faith is in religion and therefore you can discount it because it means believing without evidence, but there's no faith in science. And that's entirely false. And that leads to sheer nonsense. Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, wrote once, our faith is not a faith, our beliefs are not a belief. He was just so confused by these double meanings. And Richard Dawkins, atheists, I quote, have no faith. And then he writes a book about what he believes. It is got into a massive problem. Now, thinking about thinking, mathematics and the mind, what's at issue here? What is at issue here is the amazing thing that you can understand the universe to some extent using mathematics. Einstein was clever enough to see there was a problem. The only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. And he says that science can only be created by those who are thoroughly imbued with the aspiration towards truth and understanding. This source of feeling, however, springs from the sphere of religion. To this there also belongs the faith, please notice that, the faith in the possibility that the regulations valid for the world of existence are rational. That is comprehensible to reason. I cannot conceive of a genuine scientist without that profound faith. The situation may be expressed by an image. Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind. And similarly, his fellow Nobel Prize winner, Eugene Wigner, says the enormous usefulness of mathematics is something bordering on the mysterious. There is no rational explanation for it. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand or deserve. And when I was at Cambridge, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne tried to teach me quantum physics. He says physics is powerless to explain its fundamental belief in the mathematical intelligibility of the universe. Let's pause there and think what this means. It means that every scientist has a credo, has a faith, one that science can be done. I wouldn't do mathematics if I didn't believe it could be done. Newton, it was his faith in God that inspired him to study the universe, because that was the basis for thinking that the universe was rational and therefore it could be understood. And Polkinghorne is right, for the very simple reason that unless you believe physics can be done, you'll never do any physics. Unless you believe that the universe is accessible, at least in part, to the human mind, you'll never do any science. So here's the very interesting thing. When it comes to motivation at the side of Newton, it was faith in God. But what about scientists who don't believe in God? What is the basis for their faith? And sometimes I ask my colleagues, what do you do science with? And they say, you mean and they nearly say mind, but then they believe it's not politically correct to say mind, so they say brain. And I say, okay, you do it with your brain. Tell me about the brain. Well, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and say, and you trust it? Tell me honestly, would you trust your computer if you knew it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process? I've never heard the answer yes to that. And then they say, where did you get that argument? I said, you'll be surprised, it comes from Charles Darwin. With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. This is known as Darwin's doubt. And Alvin Plantinga, who's a world-class philosopher, puts it this way: if Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given a strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief they produce, including his own atheism. But most interestingly, Thomas Nagel is a world-class philosopher. He's also a hard atheist. He doesn't want there to be a God. But he's seen a huge problem, and he's written a book, as you see, with a very provocative subtitle. And in it he said, if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. So the conclusion is, in the words of my colleague Keith Ward at Oxford, if biblical theism is true, not only is matter not the only reality, matter is not even the prime reality. So my conclusion is this. Do science and God mix? Has science buried God? No, it hasn't. Science and God mix very well. But I don't think science and atheism mix very well, because it seems to me that atheism logically leads to doubt about the validity of the rational processes needed to do science. And therefore, I find very much more plausible the statement that the Word was in the beginning and was the Creator. But then there's a hugely bigger question that floats in, and that is, what about the infinitely greater claim? Not only is there a mind behind the universe, but did that Word become human and dwell among us? But that's a story for another time. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Professor Lennox, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody for submitting your questions as we've been going on. I'm going to give you 2 seconds to have a drink, and then we'll...
That's very gracious. Yes, thank you.
So, yeah, I have an iPad full of questions here, and we've got just under half an hour. So, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I haven't seen any of these questions, of course, but I've encountered some of them before. But this is a Q&A, ladies and gentlemen, and so it's a desperately inadequate process. Why is that? Well, first of all I can give you is my immediate reaction to the question, and I shall do that. But if that doesn't satisfy you, that's a very good thing, because if you've come with a genuine question tonight, the far more important thing is the research you do to get an answer that does satisfy you. I can only hint at the beginning of the way in which I would approach this kind of thing. Okay. I'm just going to go randomly down and order them in some kind of sense, taking the more scientific ones first, because inevitably there are questions that go beyond science. How do you respond to a theory such as the multiverse when no evidence is even offered? Now, the idea behind this is that in order to increase the probabilities of us finding ourselves in a universe like this, there is what is called an infinite ensemble of universes in which everything that can happen does happen. And so since there's going to be one like this, it's not surprising that we're in it. I find that profoundly unconvincing, because it seems to me to be a massive violation of what's called Occam's razor, which is the idea that's been around for centuries, that you economize on hypotheses, and to postulate, as one of my scientific colleagues has said, a billion universes as opposed to a single creator seems to be wildly over the top. Now, the questioner says when no evidence is offered. That's not quite true, actually. Evidence is offered, because David Deutsch and his colleagues at Oxford will argue that there's a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics, that when various things split, they split into different universes. But the questioner is quite correct by saying that we have no access to these universes, and that makes quantum physicists like Professor John Polkinghorne, whom I have mentioned, very skeptical. But now the other thing that comes up with the multiverse is, the subtle subtext is, it's either a multiverse or God the Creator. In fact, The man who pushed the multiverse idea, and still does, Max Tegmark in Princeton, said there's either a creator or a multiverse. But any sensible philosopher will, and they have pointed it out, that that apposition is completely false. It's not God or the multiverse. If there is a creator, he can create as many universes as he likes. And there is a rumor in a book that I rather take seriously, the Bible, that this might not be the only one. So there's no access to these universes. And so it seems largely a matter of speculation. And there's huge disagreement out there in the scientific world. For instance, between Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose over these issues. Now, I have written a little book. This is shameless advertising. But since somebody has asked about the multiverse, this is the shortest book I've ever written, and it's called God and Stephen Hawking. And it deals with some of the things I've mentioned tonight, but it also brings in some of the things I haven't, like the universe. Okay. In the past, we were hindered by a flawed understanding and approach to science. Science has freely evolved since then. Why can't we evolve our thinking on God? Well, of course, science has developed, and what we believe is happening, well, if you're a critical realist like me, what one believes is happening, otherwise I wouldn't bother, is that there is truth out there. There's objective truth to be understood. I'm not a postmodernist. And that's one of the things I share with Richard Dawkins, because we were asked at a press conference after the debate, was there anything we had in common? And I said, I suspect we have in common that we believe there's truth out there to be accessed. And he nearly said amen, but that wouldn't have fitted in. So it is important to realize that there are things in common. I wouldn't do science if I didn't think there was truth out there to be accessed. But I know enough about the history of science to realize that scientists have often got it wrong. Nevertheless, we do feel that we are getting better incrementally. Galileo moved us on, and then Kepler moved us on, and Newton moved us on, and Einstein moved us even further. But the results of Einstein don't negate all the results of Newton. It's still a very good approximation. So we mustn't think in terms of total revolution, although in science there have been total revolutions. For instance, in geology, the idea of tectonic plates was a complete revolution in the theory when it came about. Our thinking about God, well, it does, of course, through the ages, become more developed. Indeed, that is obvious if you read a book like the Bible, because the information is cumulative. It is built up, and the Bible claims that it is a revelation from God, but it's not all at once. It grows and grows, so that there is less information about God in Genesis than there is in the Gospel of John. So it does develop. But again, we humans can get it wrong about God. Let me put it this way. There's a parallel here. You see, scientists study a given. They don't invent the universe. Mind you, they can invent lots of things about the universe. But they're studying a given, and they're studying the given with a given. That is their mind. Now, it's exactly the same in Christianity. I have a given, and it's the Bible, the Word of God, the Scripture. I study that with a given, my human mind. And of course, I have a very high view of the Bible. That's another topic. But I'm honest enough to say that I could get it wrong, that my interpretation of that could be wrong, just as a scientist's interpretation of the physical universe could get it wrong. And in that sense, we're always seeking to improve and allow our views to evolve. Now, where did God come from? Something cannot come from nothing. So God, being something, must have come from somewhere. Now, this is a variant on the theme of Dawkins, where he regards this as a knockdown thing. If you believe in a creator, then who created the universe, then you must be able to ask who created the creator, and then who created the creator that knew on forever, and that's nonsense, so we forget it and play football. Now, I'm fascinated by logic. I suppose it's an answer to the question at the beginning. Mathematics and logic for me are very close together. So let's think of the question, who or what created the creator? Where did God come from? Well, who or what created X? What does that assume? It assumes that X was created. If you say, what created X? You're assuming X was created. So the question bypasses the possibility that X is not created. And you see, that's exactly the status of the God of the Bible. The claim is he was not created. The question doesn't apply to him. And you notice, by the way, Dawkins did not write a book entitled The Created God's Delusion. Because, of course, we don't need him or anybody else to tell us that created gods are a delusion. The substantive question is not addressed. And the substantive question is there an uncreated God? And the Greeks were very interested in the idea of the difference between things that came to exist, like you and me in the universe, and things that didn't come to exist. Was there anything eternal? And that's the question we need to address. Is there evidence that there exists an eternal God? Now, when Dawkins asked me this question, I twisted it slightly to ask him the same question. I said, you think this is a valid question, who created the creator? Fine. You believe the universe created you, so who created your creator? I've waited 10 years for an answer to that question. I never got it. The point is, as has been pointed out, philosophically, what you're really asking, is there an ultimate reality? The questions don't go back forever. And the answer on both sides is yes. My atheist friends think the ultimate reality is either mass energy or these days nothing, interpreted in a certain way. And as a Christian, I believe the ultimate reality is God. There's ultimate reality on both sides. So the substantive question then is, which is the true ultimate reality? And then you have to ask, what is the evidence for it? So in answer to where did God come from, I say the question does not have a meaning as applied to God, because God is eternal. And eternal things don't come from anywhere. And what you've got to get your mind around is answer the question for yourself. Is there anything eternal or not? I used to have a lot of fun with this in Russia, because many of them still believed the universe was eternal. And I'd ask them, oh, so you can't believe in anything eternal. What about the universe? Well, it's always been there. Oh, so you do believe in something eternal. So your problem is what? You can't believe in an eternal person. And then we had a meaningful dialogue in that. Okay. Do you think that atheist scientists use the science of the gaps by using multiverse, quantum vacuum, etc.? Now, that is a very important observation, because we hear God of the gaps all the time as a pejorative statement made against believers like myself. But there sure is a science of the gaps. You know, I can't explain it, therefore the multiverse did it. Or I can't explain it, therefore evolution did it, and so on. And often these words are simply a cover-up for ignorance. And some of the world's leading biologists have pointed that out, of the danger of using words with empty content. They don't mean anything. As a Nobel Prizer once said, so your mass of chemicals became a chicken. Evolution did it. He said that's a completely empty statement, because we don't know how it happened. So it's a lovely corrective to hear people talk about things of the gaps. They happen all over the place. People tell just so stories, like how did the elephant get his trunk and all this kind of stuff. And it happens even in science. And the great scientists do admit it. There are several questions on evolution. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Is it possible to believe God created us through evolution? Now, the quote is from Theodosius Dobzhansky, who is a very famous Russian biologist. And the statement is actually false. And I'm not a biologist, so you take this with a pinch of salt. But I read a great deal of biology, including Dobzhansky. You see, in biology, we got life. And nowadays, even Dawkins recognizes that evolution has nothing to do with the origin of life. You see, there are two things, not one. There's the question of how life came to exist in the first place. Then there is the question of how it developed. By definition, whatever you think evolution is or isn't, you can have no meaningful evolution without life being there. You must have a mutating replicator in order for evolution to occur. So evolution has nothing whatsoever to say about the origin of life. And yet, for many years, many of you may well have read Dawkins' book. It's brilliantly written, The Blind Watchmaker. And one of the central statements is that natural selection, the blind, automatic, etc. mechanism that Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and variation for all life. It's not. And he's retracted the first half of the statement. The origin of life remains the great puzzle. And so, could God have created through evolution? Well, certainly not life in the first place, because evolution is meaningless if you don't have life in the first place. Now, I'm not about to give a lecture on evolution. If you want to know what I think about it, have a look at the book out there. God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? It's the title of our lecture, but it's much more extensive. And I've got another book, which is quite controversial, but I like writing controversial things, called 7 Days That Divide the World, where I give my own reaction to the notion of, that's explained here, of what's called theistic evolution, is that God uses the mechanism of evolution. My response to that is quite complex. It depends entirely what you mean by evolution. Just look around this room. Do any two of us look the same? No. Why is that? Well, a lot of selecting went on and mutating went on and people chose and so on. So we don't all look the same. In the sense of evolution meaning change through mutation and selection, we are all involved in it, whether we like it or not. So certainly in the sense of change within a species, there's no controversy about it at all. And if you're a believer in God like me, then God uses it. I selected my wife, at least I think I did. She selected me. There could be no reason for that whatsoever. But you know how these things happen and so on. It is the fact that I think it's about 25% of us suffer from a mutation that will eventually finish our lives. Mutation and selection do something. And if they exist and do something, then from a theistic point of view, they were created by God. But the big question, both scientifically and from my perspective as a Christian, are, do they do everything? In other words, can they start with the most rudimentary life, which we don't know how to explain whatsoever, and can they account for developing it? I talk to a lot of people who are leaders in the field of nanotechnology, working at the basic chemistry of life. And it's very interesting to talk to them. You talk to them too and see what they really think. The one that's well worth looking up is one of the brightest in the world. His name is James Tour, Tour, of Rice University and read what he has to say about the origin of life. Now, granted that evolution, which has at least 5 or 6 meanings, one of its meanings is something that Darwin noticed and we notice and is quite non-controversial, then of course, by definition, believing in that doesn't obviate belief in God. Now, there are other people, many friends of mine, who go much further than that. And they would call themselves essentially neo-Darwinists. And they would argue in the following way. They would say, look, the discovery of the law of gravity doesn't mean you stop believing in God. And the discovery of a mechanism in nature that does something, natural selection and mutation, doesn't mean you stop believing in God, because the existence of a mechanism that does something is not in itself an argument for the non-existence of a creator of that mechanism. Now, this view, which is called theistic evolution, is totally different from the Dawkins view and the Dennett view, because they believe, by definition, evolution is a mindless, unguided process. They have no time for theistic evolution. Now, I'm a mathematician, and you're asking the wrong person, really, this question, because we have a track record in this respect of high skepticism about the capacity of any view of evolution to deal with what we observe in nature today. And there's a whole literature in that. But the bottom line for me is simple. You cannot argue atheism from biology. After all, biology is a scientific subject. Atheism is a worldview. And therefore, that explains, and the answer to your question is, of course, here's, can a person believe that God created us through evolution? Well, many people do. I happen to believe that it is much more complex than that, and if you want to know what I think, you have to look at one of my books. We got a little bit more time? Oh, very good. Now let's have a look and see. It's just I'm noticing there's a whole lot of questions that are essentially the same. Okay, well, I think this is the biggest question. Well, it's not the biggest. There are 2 big questions here. Firstly, can anyone come to God if they have never received his personal revelation? The answer to that, as I understand it, is everybody receives, at least in part, God's revelation. It's all around us. It's the universe. And the Bible asserts that. The heavens declare the glory of God. And the heavens show the earth shows his handiwork. And in his argument at the beginning of the letter to the Romans, Paul says the invisible things of God are perceived in the things that are made from the beginning of creation. You will notice he's very careful. He doesn't say they're proved for the reason I mentioned earlier. He says they're perceived. So there is what theologians call a general revelation of God. And it is so powerful, according to Paul, that if we disregard it, we are without excuse. So my short answer to that, and there's a lot more that needs to be said, is his revelation is in the nature of the universe and then in the nature of human beings, because the claim is that we are made in the image of God. Now, there are several questions about what evidence points you to the God of the Bible rather than any other God or creator. And I want to relate this to another couple of questions. If God does exist, why does he allow so much suffering in the world? Have you ever had a question to do with Christianity that you couldn't answer? If there's a perfect creator or intelligent designer, why are there so many flaws in the world around us, such as our bodies that can get cancer and disease? Even if we can find scientific evidence for a divine creator God, why must we then assume this God to be the personal God of the Bible? Why did God create sin, allowing the devil to exist? Well, all those questions are related. Have you ever met a question that you couldn't answer frequently? Certainly not the mathematical ones. But the hard question, the really hard question for any of us, whatever our worldview, is the problem of evil and suffering. That's the hard one. And there are no simplistic answers to that question, ladies and gentlemen. Now, I know it's off our topic, but I think in view of this mass of questions, you would probably like me to answer it, would you? Yeah. You'd like me to say something about it. Well, I will, but it will be very inadequate. But because I regard it as so important, I will say something about it. I arrived in New Zealand 2 days after the earthquake, which you will remember. And I had to cancel all my talks and change them to the one talk they wanted, Earthquakes, Why? And that raised the question that's raised here. Why is the world like that, with earthquakes and cancers and tsunamis and so on? Why is there so much evil? Now, there are two problems here. The first is that problem, the problem of natural evil, which we often call the problem of pain. And then there's the problem of moral evil, the horrific things that people do to each other. They can be connected. Human greed can cause deforestation and lead to famine. So there can be an intimate connection between moral evil and natural evil. And we've all, particularly in our student days, gone through endless arguing. Surely if there's a perfect, benevolent God, he could, should, would, and all this kind of thing we go through. And I would think that none of us in this room has ever heard a satisfactory solution to that. It's Epicurus' old problem, as David Hume put it. Either God is all-powerful or all good. He can't be both because evil exists. And that's the problem. Now, let me just say a couple of things. There are two perspectives on these two problems. The first perspective is that of the observer. The second is that of the sufferer. Cancer looks very different in the eye of a professor of oncology than it does in the eye of a young woman who's been told she's got 2 months to live. And that's why we often feel when this question comes up that an over-intellectualized answer doesn't touch the human heart. And an over-emotional answer doesn't give anything for the mind to get into. And that's why we need both. So we're presented with an intellectual challenge as well as a pastoral challenge. And I'm very aware of that. I'm very aware that in this room there are people who are really hurting. And it's not an intellectual answer you need. You need something to establish your heart. But it may be you want to make sense of it because it is so overwhelmingly problematic as you face it. It's a daunting task, and I want to say straight away, I have every sympathy for people who turn to atheism because of it. I've been to Auschwitz many times. I've sat with many people who've lost all their relatives in that kind of Holocaust. And what do you say when they turn to you and say, sorry, you may talk about the science and the evidence for God in the universe, but don't talk to me about a personal God of love. That's insulting me. I understand that. I've never come out of Auschwitz without weeping. And it really is a hard question. But I want to suggest, ladies and gentlemen, it is first of all a hard question because atheism doesn't solve it. What do I mean by that? Well, I've often sat with people who said, I'm sorry, we don't believe in a personal God, we're atheists, and they talk of some atrocity. And I say, okay, you've got rid of the problem. Do you think the answer is, well, as Richard Dawkins puts it, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. There's no rhyme, nor reason, nor morality. Which is a very odd thing to say, because there's no problem of evil if there's no such thing as morality. Atheists have a huge problem there when they deny morality. But I leave that for a moment. I said, okay, you think you've got rid of the problem, but you haven't got rid of the suffering. It's still there. And in fact, I might argue that you could even have made it worse, because what you have got rid of is all hope, by definition. If there is no God, if death is the end, then you have, by definition, absolutely no hope. And often they admit that's the case. And then they say to me, but how can you have hope? And I say, well, let me try to explain it to you. So my first point is, atheism doesn't solve the existential problem, but can make it a lot worse. Secondly, it's the response to this problem that enables me to make most sense out of Christianity than any other religion. I'll explain that in a moment. I have great respect for my friends in virtually all religions. And before you even mention other religions, the important thing to realize is that the kind of morality expressed in the golden rule, do unto others what you would they do to you, is to be found in every religion on earth and every philosophy. And we need to respect other people where they differ. And they all agree that they differ in this. It's not my view simply, it's a fact. They differ on the basis of relationship to God. Now let me approach this question. How can I face this as a Christian? Well, to cut a very long story short, and it is a very long story because the topic is so important, I approach it this way. Christianity tells us something unique. It tells us about a suffering God. And as I put it to many people, I say, you know, one of the things that's at the heart of my Christian faith, which may be very difficult for you, but just come with me and try to understand what Christianity says before you reject it, is that Christ was the Word of God incarnate, as I claimed on the last slide. And you know that he ended up being crucified. Now, if that is God, what is God doing on a cross? And the obvious answer to that at the lowest level of understanding is that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. That's a huge thing to say. Is there really a God like that? And you know, when you go back to those endless arguments, surely God could have made a world where earthquakes didn't happen, where cancers didn't happen. That's a fascinating question because, you know, if there were no tectonic plates, you would not be alive. Human life would be impossible without the function of the tectonic plates. Did you realize that? And that creates a very odd kind of problem. Couldn't God have made a universe without that? Surely a good God could, etc. Could he not have made a universe where people didn't have free will to bash each other? Now my answer to that is, of course he could. And so can we. We can make robotic universes, but there's no morality in them and there's no love. If we wish for a universe where bad things can't happen, we're wishing ourselves out of existence because we would not be in it. Now, let me come to the bottom line. Our problem with all of this is that the world presents us with a mixed picture. I call it beauty and barbed wire, or beauty in bombs. We see magnificent beauty in the Andromeda Galaxy. We see the bombs in Syria. And it's a mixed picture. And that's the way it is. And any philosophy or religion that doesn't face that is not worthy of attention. Now, that's the way it is. And my question is this. Granted that's the way it is there any evidence in all of history and experience that there's a God that we could trust with it? That's a huge question. And ladies and gentlemen, since I've been asked that question, I believe there is, and it's utterly unique. Jesus Christ competes with no other religion for the simple reason that he offers us something that none of the others do. He offers us, if we've made a mess of things, and we have, forgiveness, peace with God, and we can test that if we trust him. But in addition to that, the thing that changes the whole complexion of this question is the fact that he didn't only die, he rose again. And if he's broken the death barrier, that opens up a huge hope for the future, because death is not the end. But as I said, that is really a story for another time. Thank you for listening.
Professor Lennox, thank you very much. We really appreciate you coming to Reading. We appreciate you sharing your position with regard to science and God, and also answering those questions too. I just want to ask Chris, who is running the bookstall, to come and share with us what books we can find. Chris, do you want to use that microphone?
Okay, it's really great to be with you. If like me, you've listened to John and absolutely loved what he had to say, and thought I would love to listen for another couple of hours, which I'm sure you probably do. A great opportunity to obviously do that and to find out more about what John has to say is in his books. So he's already mentioned a couple of those on the table there. God and Stephen Hawking, God's Undertaker. There's another one there, which is a new book, which he's just written, called Determined to Believe. Those are all on the bookstore. So please come and have a look around. Lots of other books around the same sort of subjects as well. Just two others which I wanted to mention because they're both classics, a new classic and an old classic. The old classic is John Blanchard's book, Does God Believe in Atheists? That's at a very special price for this evening only. And a newer one, Making Sense of God by Tim Keller, again at a very special price this evening. So please come and have a look at those and get your Christmas presents all sorted out this evening. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Chris. Just by way of closing, please do fill in those feedback forms and drop them off. Drinks are going to be served in the foyer. Ladies and gentlemen, please give another hand for John Lennox.